What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that pays attention to leadership. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the Duke of York. We'll even throw in a Pizza Express voucher. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make Britain work. We discuss everything from the viability of high street restaurant chains to discussing economic theory and John Maynard Keynes. And of course the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Robert Keane, the Director General of the British International Freight Association, or BIFA. Writing a foreword in this year's review alongside the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Robert has referred to the freight forwarding industry as the lifeblood of British international trade, and who could disagree with him? Robert refers to the Brexit saga, and what a saga it has been. We'll certainly discuss that, but also the myriad other issues that affect the sector and what BIFA and its members are forecasting for the year ahead.
Robert, welcome.
Good morning.
We're not there yet, but thank you very much, Robert, for joining us today. And I thought we'd just really get straight into it. It's been, in terms of policy announcements, or indeed policy non-announcements, in terms of the international scene and the domestic market, it's been quite a 12 months. I thought it might be best to start with your thoughts. And perhaps a small review of the last year in the sector. A good year, a bad year, or something in the middle?
Yeah, I would say something in the middle because with regard to the sector and the international effect on shipping, surcharges, traffic levels, they've been up and down. From a personal point of view, for our association, it's been a great year. We've achieved quite a bit. However, we have been hampered somewhat by government indecision and difficulties with Brexit, as I'm sure everybody knows. It's a hot potato.
Well, I think, Robert, since you said the B word first, I to talk about now. Obviously, so many of your members, small, medium, large businesses around the country, have been doing their best to prepare. But of course, you've already identified, I think, the key problem here is that simply people don't know what's going to happen. And we've been here for 3 years now. I mean, has the government handled this at all well, Robert?
We're a political organisation, so very difficult to comment on the government. So the civil service people that we deal with have been doing the best under the circumstances. However, they can only deal with facts, and facts have been scarce and few on the ground over the last 3 years. We advised people to make preparations as far as we can tell. We don't monitor all of our members, but anecdotal sort of evidence or empirical evidence is that most of them are making strenuous efforts to be prepared. But there's always the chicken and egg situation of will they need extra staff? Where are they going to get the staff from? When will they need the staff? And with the constantly postponed dates of leaving the EU and the lack of information about whether there will be a transition period, they just don't know what to do, really.
And of course, we speak in the midst of a general election, so they ruined everybody's Christmas, but it does mean we know for a fact, the one fact we do know is that no one will know any other facts until this thing is over.
Absolutely. We've still, there are so many imponderables. There's the fact that the flex extension that we've heard about is the end of January. I don't think anybody thinks that we are going to leave at the end of January unless we crash out, unless the outcome of the general election could affect that, of course. It may well be that there will be some form of majority that will just take the option of leaving. We have advised members to prepare at all times for a no deal, because it's always a possibility there in the background. Even with the rearguard sort of action by a combination of parties and politicians, it's still something that could happen. We think that the EU doesn't want, it's not in the EU's, the other EU countries' interests to crash out, or for us to crash out, but there must be a certain amount of impatience over on the other side of the channel. What are the British doing? So, again, we're back to the crystal ball. Nobody knows.
It's almost really, Robert, it's ridiculous to say so, but it's almost quite difficult to talk about because we just don't know where we'll be after this election result. I can, and perhaps it's an unfair question, Robert, but I can only assume and hope that the majority of your members are really just in the vote that whatever the result is, it ends in a decision one way or the other.
Yes, that's something that has come through, mainly from the people. We have a very wide range of members dealing with all sorts of industries. We've got niche players, we've got big multinational companies, but certainly certainty is what, and I think this is the case, I think this is also the case not just for our industry, but also for all industries. Business needs certainty, and if I don't think there's any political issues. I think there was at the beginning, I think there was a feeling that the forwarding sector is going to be okay, because think of all that extra work you're going to have to do. But certainly we've heard all over for the last 3.5 years, we've not come across any of our members who are sort of rubbing their hands together, thinking, "Great, lots of complications means lots of work for us." They prefer the status quo. They're well aware that the easier trade is, the more trade there is, and they can earn a living from that. And they, in a time of full employment in the UK, or virtually full employment, as full as it's ever been for many, many years, it's very difficult to think where they're going to get extra staff from or train those staff.
It's a problem that is probably not addressed enough in the main media, but it's something that's going to be potentially quite troubling going forward. And I think perhaps if we just, I know we could talk about Brexit all day, but we shouldn't, though, for the sake of the listeners as well. In terms of related, but in terms of customs declaration, of course, HMRC will be moving from the custom handling of import and export freight to the customs declaration service. And yes. I think some people are thankful for that just because it's a short acronym. But what is BIFA's current take on how the movement's been on it?
Okay. Well, we did have concerns, and we in fact issued a press release earlier in this year where we highlighted our concerns, and we had some robust conversations with HMRC. We're satisfied now that the progress seems to be on track. I was talking to some software houses who prepare the software for transmitting customs declarations, and they're working flat out now, and it does seem that the thing is on track. We've got one of our staff, one of our customs experts, in close liaison with the HMRC team. So we're reasonably reassured that everything that can be being done is being done, and that they are working towards the deadline. We have an undertaking that they won't switch off Chief until CDS is working properly.
Yeah, they don't. Am I right in saying, Rob, sorry to interrupt, the preliminary deadline for that was March 2021? Yes.
Yeah, and I believe that's still there, because they don't want to extend the chief contract with the company that supplies and maintains the service. So that's all factored in, and they're working towards it. So reasonably reassured. And at the present stage that it's on track and going okay.
Excellent. Well, fingers crossed, and we keep a close eye on that.
I would interject that, of course, that will then give us problems somewhere down the line because there's a wholesale change in how the members work. We did hold seminars last year, 2018, where we alerted them to the changes coming along, but there were too many variables to give them concrete information, and at some point we may well have to again reconvene seminars around the country for our members to give them explanations of the changes. So that'll keep us busy probably in late 2020, 2021.
And an understatement, I think everybody knows that is. Now, you've already mentioned it, Robert, and I think I'd love to go in a bit more detail about it. You had a sort of very busy last 12 months, especially when it comes to what you've been doing internally, including, of course, creating your young forwarder network off the back of your fantastic apprenticeship scheme. It would be great if you could spend a couple of minutes letting the listeners know more about that program and what it's done.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's been a bit of a journey, really, because I chose to change the way we did training. I started in 2016 by hiring somebody with a mission to change things around, and it was slow progress to begin with, but we purchased the IPR of a company that used to come in and just deliver courses that we arranged, and we hired trainers, and we actually took over the provision of it and ownership of it. So in a very small time, we've gone from a booking agency to an actually fully fledged training provider. Now, on the back of that, members were complaining that apprenticeships, they weren't very happy with apprenticeships. And I think this was mirrored across industry in that other industries, that people getting apprentices were frustrated by the fact that apprentice providers were putting people through business administration courses, and they wanted something specific for their industries. Trailblazer apprenticeships were instigated by the government a few years ago, and one of our members came to us and said, we need a freight forwarding apprenticeship. It has to be driven by industry. So we got about 40 of our members. We've got about 1,500 members, got about 40 of them together, and really we underpinned it, and the guy that I employed back in 2016 to take training forward put a huge amount of personal effort into it, and we, with the forwarders, came up with an apprenticeship which was approved. Since then, things have really taken off. I think in the first year we had about 150 new entrants to the industry with undertaking the freight forwarder apprenticeship, and a byproduct of it was that one of the courses that we'd actually bought the IPR of it and we'd modified, well, in fact, two of the courses that we had now control over were eminently suitable for the apprenticeship. So we've gone from delivering one of our sort of hallmark courses is a 5-day BTEC approved qualification. And we did perhaps 5 of these one year, 4 of them another year, and in this year we're undertaking 27 of them. So we've expanded the I've now got 3 full-time trainers working for the chap who I employed, let's say, back in 2016, started 2016. And our headcount's gone up 50%. We've gone from 10 people to 15 people in a very short period of time. And that brings with it a number of challenges. But on the back of this as well, something that I've always wanted to do was try and get something for younger people, because your average apprentice or young person leaving school looking for a job who starts with a freight forwarder would join a company at an industrial estate, say in Slough, and then after a couple of years, if they want to make a move through a job agency of some sort, they'll move to another industrial estate, perhaps in Hayes or something like that. But there's they only work with the people they work with. Now, it's probably a legacy of when I started a long time ago, that pre-computers, as what was called a long room boy or a runner, your very first job was going from customs to airlines to agents, and there were a whole troop of younger people there. And those networks stood you in good stead for the rest of your working life. You, as you climbed the greasy pole and got promoted, you would find, in the other companies that you had to deal with, you'd have friends, and wanted to try and recreate a little bit of that, give them a network in the industry rather than be isolated. Also some professional development and also a social side. So we came up with the Young Forwarder Network, very much in fledgling stages at the moment. Very difficult to get employers to buy in because they're always so busy, and getting them to let people out has been a challenge, but it's working quite well. We will. Sorry, carry on.
No, sorry, I think it's not only is it sort of fantastic that the scheme's clearly been a success so far, but I think what a great takeaway from that is the ability to really engage well with young people, because especially in a sector such as your own, it's not necessarily one that is necessarily the first in people's minds. How have you found, and it sounds positive, obviously, how have you found that engagement with young people who are completely sometimes new to the sector?
Yeah, well, it's really the same as it's always been. It would be great if people look towards logistics as a career, because it is fantastically rewarding. But again, if I go back in time to when I started, it wasn't something I knew about. I watched my friends go to university. I didn't know and thought, what shall I do? And I fell into the industry. Within a short time, I found it exciting and exhilarating, as I think most people do. It's a very fantastic industry as you go along, and the amount of travel that you get that you just wouldn't think moving boxes or filling forms in would actually open these doors for you. And the youngsters are embracing this. In fact, we have one member I went to visit recently, and his apprentice, who's 18, has been sent by them to their Hong Kong office for experience, which is really good at that age. But he's a cut above. He's an excellent chap.
No, it's something that's fantastically, as you said, rewarding, and hopefully we can speak again before long and find out how much more success there's been with the network. Now, in terms of again, I do have to bring up politics again, but we are on a general election after all. There have been, even from the Conservative Party, promises of a lot of spending on infrastructure. Now, I think perhaps most important right now, and perhaps relevant, is Heathrow. It feels like this has gone on, and I suppose it has, for so many years. What do you hope will be the future of this decision, and what do you think will happen at this point?
Okay, well, I guess it is possible that, especially against the background of the pressure that, say, Extinction Rebellion is putting on the media, and it's in our faces, the need for sustainability. However, as far as I know with Heathrow, and again, I seem to remember it was 2 or 3 years ago, there was an infrastructure sort of body set up, and once the thing had passed to that and given it to go ahead, whilst there are still rumblings and local councils talking about taking action, I believe that we're on a path that's not completely irreversible, but we are on that path, and it is anticipated Heathrow will be delivered. There may be through a couple more roadblocks put in the way, but I think there are the means and there is the will of industry and UK PLC to have it delivered, and for the good of the UK as well.
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right, but at this point it's quite difficult to see how exactly a significant roadblock would arise at this point. Never say never, but it rather looks like this is set, and no doubt the industry is very happy. In terms of other priorities for our infrastructure, especially when it comes to maybe the ports, where would your priorities lie at the moment?
Okay. Well, we tend to leave that actually to sort of sister organisations or cousin organisations, the Freight Transport Agency, Freight Transport Association, and the Road Haulage Association, so we concentrate really on our members' needs, and a lot of our members don't have huge assets; they're non-asset based. So it's the bigger people who are challenged by this, the multinationals, and they're usually spoken for by other associations. So, I mean, we say Me Too now and then. I mean, the concerns over the M20 and Operation Brock. Moving stuff from Dover is a great concern to members. Generally, with HS2, for example, we think it's good. It's a shame that everybody in the media sort of concentrates on shaving 5 minutes off a journey time, when the real benefit of HS2 is to free up so many more train lines. Yeah, capacities to. There's no capacity there at the moment to take freight off the roads, but HS2 can free up that capacity. But of course, the headlines are always about, it's going to take you 5 minutes or save you 10 minutes getting to Birmingham. Big deal. How much does that cost? Which isn't the real point. But things seem to be moving along okay. If I was to tiptoe into politics, I would only just say that with some of these spending pledges we're getting at the moment, you think, well, if they're that important, why haven't you done anything about them in the past 10 years or so? You know, it always comes around at election time, and it's rather, I don't know, it's rather sad to see these promises of spending from both sides or all sides, and the cynic in you thinks, well, haven't I heard it all before?
Well, perhaps we should, before we get carried away, we should tiptoe back out of politics. This might be something that I don't know how relevant it might be. I would love to know that. I think they'd be interested in knowing. It was 3 years ago, obviously, when the new President Trump got elected, on a promise of tariffs and a promise of which he duly did. And 3 years down the line, there certainly has been an effect, most often notably in the media at the moment, is to do with EU subsidies for Airbus, affecting, obviously, Scotch exports. Have your members at any level seen how this has slowed the pace of trade?
We haven't had anybody knocking our door talking about this. In passing at certain conversations, we hold fora with the members for either specific issues like customs or air or surface freight, and we have regional meetings where we gather together as many members. And sort of on the margins, there's disapproval of the situation of the trade war between the US and China, and we have heard comments on it, but our members tend to resiliently get on with the job, curse on the sidelines about certain issues, but I haven't heard too much more. Going tiptoe back into Brexit again, we did hear from members, some of their customers in the last couple of years, relocating production to continental Europe from the UK. So some of that has happened. Some people have made their mind up and they've closed production lines and manufacturing in the UK and moved it already.
Now, and less of a tiptoe, more of a lunge, I suppose. All right, but Will, instead of and I'm conscious of the time here, perhaps it would be pleasant to end here on what are your thoughts and really the association's hopes for the next 12 months going forward.
To some extent, I always say this every year to the board in December when we have where I give a report on my previous year's activity and what I expect to do, and I usually sum it up with more of the same. It's been a bit of a roller coaster ride for the last sort of 3 or 4 years, and there's no reason why we can't keep building on it.
You could have written the script if you tried.
Well, it's a bit of luck. It's being, right place, right time. Having a very supportive board of directors who've given me the freedom to try chance my arm on some projects, and they've worked. So I'm going to carry on with that. I want to build up the young people's. I'm just to backtrack. We have a slight concern with apprenticeships because. You have a strange situation where a lot of big companies are paying an apprenticeship levy and they're just treating it as a tax and not claiming it back. So there's apprenticeship levy money that's swilling around somewhere in government that we can't get our hands on. We've tried to suggest that this should be released for non-levy players, the small companies, to subsidise training and to build apprenticeships for the SMEs. But no, that money is expected will find its way into a big pot somewhere and be spent. And apprentice providers are finding it a little bit tough at the moment, probably until next April, to get funding for non-levy payers. So that's a bit of a fly in the ointment. We don't know necessarily that we have the same numbers coming through. But hopefully once this business of Brexit is resolved, as I say, once Brexit's done, and we could talk about that again, whether it will be done and how much complications will follow. But one does hope at one stage that government will function a little bit more normally, and there will be more priorities for all of the things in our sector. Yes, it would be nice to have more funds available for training and education, but I'm sure every other sector's got its shopping list of things that they'd like.
Well, I think you speak on behalf of an awful lot of people in the country when you say that. Robert, thank you very much for joining us today. Obviously, we'll all look forward to reading next year's forward on behalf of the association. And hopefully when we speak next, there will be a little more certainty and we'll be able to use less hypotheticals. Robert, thank you very much.
That's all right, Jonathan. Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Robert, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at BIFA are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist. That's flags to you and me. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoy speaking to Eric. Here it is now.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of No, I don't want to do that. No. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything, but there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something, and it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on.
To it.
I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Withdrawal Act will take place. So, as we speak, we don't quite know. As, well, perhaps like the government front bench, don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without wrecking amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40-odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December. Something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it does quite shock them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we were left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, oh no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as you correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition that claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments, they introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliché referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshirean, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? Hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament, because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I've found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership. Well, I was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up. And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you all know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. and to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools, and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
Yeah, I think so. And it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay for to be members, and it's a way of not being beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, you're echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said. What some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I'll join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to it. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story. Most people might guess that a dynamo Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
That's Che Guevara.
Which
I always had them over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Blunkett was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives would never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, for something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realised that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site, which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state. And it was on the basis of tough love. It was on the basis of getting people into jobs. It was about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress, since of course you're stepped down to being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet. This is something like that goes in the state to repress it. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old maids cycling to evensong and warband. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we're not focused on anything domestic.
Yeah, absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit of stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large, they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you also, of course, the British Envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
Really very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let listeners know what projects you are working on with that, and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country?
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament, with a learning centre below it. And the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, of 7 years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death counts. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long way. It's something I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine you were actually very content and happy because the former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you were quite unscathed from it.
I can't. He was very nice about
Yes.
it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out one or two of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
That's, but it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time, but I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years, and it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle. Those have been left behind by our economic progress, and it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know there's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the Shakespeare to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.